For today's video, we return to the Midway wrecks, which I've covered before in one of my first wreck videos. At the time, we only had the Petrel and Ballard surveys to work with. That meant very little coverage of Yorktown and only sonar for a Kaga. Kaga was the best recorded of the three, though even this was fairly limited, namely because Petrel was suffering technical issues with their ROV. In the time since then, another survey was made of the wrecks. This is more notable for a Kaga in Yorktown, but Kaga also received a follow-up look. I've chosen to cover her wreck first because the two surveys give more material. It's easier to work with and gives me a better idea of what I'm looking at. In any case, let's get into things. As Kaga's sinking is one of the more famous ones, I won't go into depth on that topic. Just a brief overview. On June 4th, 1942, Kaga was attacked during the Battle of Midway. While several of the bombers would miss their mark, several bombs would hit the ship. Those set off raging fires and massive secondary explosions. Those explosions doomed the carrier. While her watertight integrity seemed intact, and the ship remained afloat, well, there wasn't much of a ship left by the time the order went out to scuttle Kaga. On screen now is an image from the book Shattered Sword that shows just how burnt out she really was. There's not much to say that the picture doesn't convey. Basically everything after the island was gone, burnt to the waterline. Even if Kaga was still afloat, the ship was never going to be repaired, and towing her back to Japan wasn't worth the risk of further attack. So Kaga would be scuttled. The battered wreck would slip beneath the waves, taking 811 of the crew down with her. The highest loss of life of any of the carriers lost at Midway. And with that done, we can now move to the wreck, or rather, how the wreck was located. Pieces of the wreck were located by Nautilus in 1999, including a gun tub. The main wreck itself took much longer to find. It would only be recently, in October of 2019, that the wreck was finally located. By, of course, our old friends from RV Petrel. This expedition would also locate a Kaga, but that wreck wasn't surveyed due to the aforementioned technical issues. That would have to wait for the follow-up look by Nautilus in 2023. As for Kaga, she was found at a depth of 5,400 meters, or 17,700 feet, making her one of the deepest wrecks located as of this recording. Not the deepest, as Johnston and Samuel B. Roberts are both a good kilometer or so deeper. Still, Kaga is well past the reach of anyone without very dedicated equipment. And with that said, we can now look at the wreck, starting, as is usual with Petrel discoveries, with sonar. Just the one image in this case, though it says quite a lot. There's very little of the flight deck or superstructure left. While this affords an excellent look at Kaga's battleship lines, as a conversion, it also means the damage was worse as the ship went down. Not surprising when you look at the massive spread of debris around the ship. There's some large pieces here, likely from the flight deck, and then an extensive debris field here, with pieces of the ship scattered over a wide area, from large to small chunks, most of which I can't identify, though I'm sure someone in the comments can probably pick out individual bits. As for the main hull, it's buckled and twisted. This is also not particularly surprising, considering the damage. However, that does wrap up the sonar. Now we can look at the wreck itself. This will mostly use Petrel's survey, as Nautilus covered much of the same material, and there wasn't a huge change in the wreck in the intervening 4 years. There will be a couple exceptions, but those are just that, exceptions. The first of which, actually, is this one, where we can see the side of the ship inside the crater it did actually form. It's not noticeable on the sonar, but Kaga did dig into the bottom, and you can see how the ship is in a crater about as deep as the waterline. This side shot also allows for looking at the torpedo bulge. This is quite visible in how it extends out from the rest of the ship. You can also see a hole in the deck, although it's mostly covered in darkness. So let's move on. First, we have a closer in look at the same general area. That same hole is visible in the upper right, but to the left, we have much more visible damage to the ship. The deck basically collapses all the way down to the bulge in this area. I'm fairly certain that comes from the fires and the secondary explosions. Either way, it's very notable and very visible, as are the portholes, including one barely hanging on, with the hull ruined around it. We get an excellent look at that closer in here. The porthole is barely attached, with much of the hull twisted and missing around it. The damage is very clear. It also, interestingly, gives a look inside the ship. You can't see much in the way of detail, of course, other than some debris here. But, considering the general condition of this wreck, I'm impressed there's any interior views at all. The next look, for its part, moves up. We can see more of the deck, along with what looks like a barbette. Whatever was mounted here is long gone, leaving just a hole into the ship. And that's not the only missing detail either, because there's not much else to see here other than the deck itself. Basically just the barbette, where the deck ends here, and a bit of metal bent outward in the background. An interesting look, but not one with much detail. The same goes here, where all we have is more deck and more severe damage. This area is completely broken, with the hull falling away into a void of busted metal. The Nautilus video speculated this might be the engineering spaces, although if so, there's not much to see of it. I would suspect the damage is the result of the fires and explosions again. This is very close to the waterline, and from what I've read, none of the bombs penetrated that deeply. It doesn't rule out bomb damage, but I wouldn't expect that to be the case here. In any event, the next picture has more recognizable features. Or rather, one recognizable feature. The sponson for a gun tub bent downwards and missing its actual tub. That this is bent at such a sharp angle and empty speaks to the damage in this area. This was quite likely done by one of the secondary detonations, or alternatively by the force of the sinking, but I'd expect the sponson to be bent upwards if that were the case. The glimpse we get at blown out steel here does tend to incline me more towards an explosion. Unfortunately, it's just that, a glimpse. Nautilus didn't go far enough to see more. That said, the next area is certainly explosion damage. Here we have the hull bulged outward and broken by the force of the explosion. This is classic for that kind of damage. Much of the metal gone, and what remains bent and twisted outwards. It does, unfortunately, make it hard to glean much detail. It is a striking image, though. However, not quite as striking as this one, where we can see down on the hull where it's completely obliterated. This area was ravaged in the sinking, and there's very little recognizable about it. A hole here, and what looks like a full-on break here. This is rough. Very rough. Which makes it an interesting contrast to this image, and the last from Nautilus, where we have a view of the bow more or less intact. Even the anchor chain is still there. Compared to the rest of the wreck, it's honestly amazing this is in such good shape. And not just that, but also well preserved. Not just the anchor chain, but the capstan and other deck equipment as well. As we move to Petrel's survey, this preservation becomes even more notable. Starting, of course, with the weaponry. This is one of Kaga's 8-inch guns, which is not good. The gun is broken and fallen onto the deck, while the mount itself is covered in debris. There's also a fair amount of rusticles and silt. I'd say this is the worst of Kaga's remaining guns, as the other ones are generally more recognizable. This one is showing severe damage, and the next weapon isn't much better. This seems to be one of the 5-inch guns, as it's too small to be one of the larger weapons. If so, it's lost most of the mounting. While the barrel is remarkably intact, right down to the rifling, everything else is a different story. There's not much left to speak of, especially in the background where you go from broken metal to absolutely nothing but some debris. The next 8-inch gun is in better shape. Both the casement and the gun itself are more visible, which gives a good look at the rounded nature of the mounting, but also at the damage around it. More empty blackness to the top, and the side of the hull is missing most of its plating. The missing hull continues here on another mounting. These are matching up pretty well with the diagram from Shattered Sword. As you can see here, it shows much of the hull above the secondaries is completely gone. This is apparent on the seafloor as well. Frankly speaking, there's barely anything left of Kaga above the waterline. That these guns are so intact is almost a miracle in that regard, and you can see them both from further out here. It's a good wide-angle shot, and it also shows more of the hull buckled towards the back, probably from another internal explosion. In any case, moving further up, the lack of hull is easier to see. There's basically nothing left here above the guns. And judging from the bent out metal, there might not be much past that at all. It looks like the deck ends, and there's nothing left but a gaping hole in the ship. Unfortunately, we don't see further up, so I can't say for sure. The last casement, for its part, is missing its barrel. Beyond that, there's not much to note, other than more rusticles and missing decking. It's too dark to make out much more. So let's swap from guns to the hull. First we have this, which is apparently an uptake for the funnel. There's not much left of it at this point. It's very rusty and torn up. That there's anything left at all is surprising. Funnels are typically one of the first things to go on a wreck. The uptake isn't much thicker in the grand scheme of things, and on Kaga much of the side was blown out. Yet this survived, and you can even see the curve of the uptake here. The next picture for its part is worse. It's almost impossible to say what this is, or what it was. There's just really nothing left, other than torn and broken metal. I think there might be some piping here, and some railing here, but there's just not enough left for me to say more than that. This picture, for its part, is much the same. Metal bowed out from the side, with a gaping void beyond it. A good demonstration of the damage to Kaga, but not much more than that. To make up for that, we have a look at the deck. This is similar to the image from Nautilus, but at a closer angle. We can see more deck equipment, as well as framework for the flight deck in the background. I also think there's some degaussing cable towards the bottom. We get a better look at that here, along with some of the anchor chain barely visible on the top. What's probably more interesting, though, is the glimpse at how buried Kaga is. This is the waterline, and the mud reaches almost to the top. The ship is pretty deep into the bottom. It's easier to see that when you zoom out. We can see the deck and the anchor chains better, but also a pile of mud covering the deck. Anything past that point is completely buried in the bottom, so this is presumably where Kaga impacted the seafloor. As for the anchor chains, we can see them better here. Those are still intact and in their mounting, which is worth noting. Despite the damage and the impact with the bottom, they remained in place. The last picture for this angle, meanwhile, is one of the supports for the flight deck, which is missing most of its frame. This is the bow, so that does confirm that the bow deck is missing. And the mud almost reaches up to the top of this support, giving further evidence of how high that is as well. For all that Kaga didn't create a massive crater on the sonar, the ship is buried pretty badly. That said, we are reaching the end of this video. Just a couple more pictures to go. First, we have a side shot of the hull, mostly notable for the intact portholes and the bulged outside plating. As for the next image, it's the base of a 5-inch mount, complete with its roller blocks, still perfectly recognizable, which is a rarity on this wreck, as evidenced by this shot showing a busted torpedo bulge. This is both blown open and very nearly buried in the mud. As for the last 3 images, these all show severe damage. This one, for example, being one of the barbettes for the 8-inch guns. Not only is the casement missing entirely, but the side is blown apart next to it, with both plating peeled out here and peeled up here. And yet the worst of it is definitely this. The stern, where a good 40 or so feet of the ship, is gone, and you can see the break quite clearly here. The hull collapses in on itself, as you can see from the angle. The round bit for its part might be a base for a boat crane, and the deck comes to a jagged halt here, something far more apparent on the last image. Kaga tore apart here and comes to a sudden and jarring end, which does make for a fitting image to end on, I think. Nothing but torn metal to give mute testament to the damage this ship suffered. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.